Thanks so much, everyone. Before I begin, I do want to give just a small content warning. I am going to be discussing contemporary forms of slavery. They are fairly severe human rights abuses. I'm not going to go into the specific details of any individual survivor's story, but I will be providing illustrative examples of the kinds of practices that are included within the umbrella of modern slavery. It is a serious topic, and sometimes it can hit you even if you know it's coming. When we think about the concept of slavery, a fairly clear picture emerges. The slavery you've seen on TV and in the movies, the slavery you might have read about in history books, the slavery commemorated in museums, the slavery you may have been taught about in schools. It's a very specific phenomenon. Maybe it's hands bound in shackles. Maybe it's bodies packed together on the floor of a ship's hold. Maybe it's toiling on a field with the crack of a whip whistling overhead. The spectre of transatlantic enslavement looms large, and understandably so. 12.5 million people forcibly displaced from their homes to be shipped across the ocean on a brutal voyage that would claim the lives of 2 million human beings before they even made it to foreign shores. And the legacies of that system are alive today. Enslavers and the people they enslaved built the modern Western world, and the broken promise of emancipation and reformation continues to shape all of our lives. But it's also important to understand that this image of slavery is specific and contextualized in a time and in a place. And yet, it's not the only time in human history that a group of people decide that they could treat another as if they were less than human and exploited them as if they were property. Slavery infuses our human history. As far back as written records extend, human beings have enslaved one another. From ancient Greece, Rome, and the Near East, to the Sasanian, Abyssinian, and Akkadian empires, from the first global economies in the Indian Ocean and Asian worlds, to early Islamic law, Hindu Rajas, medieval Korea, and early Christianity, systems of enslavement are well documented. With such a long and storied history, it's really no surprise that slavery continues to be found in our world today. And it has many faces. There is no single image of enslavement in our contemporary world. In abstract terms, modern slavery is a term used to describe a set of practices, each of which is connected to the core of slavery and international law, and each of which involves severe human exploitation and dehumanization. We have slavery itself, not only chattel slavery that defines a human being as property in law, but also de facto slavery where the same relationship and behaviors manifests without the protections of law. And then we also have forced labor, that is work or service exacted under menace of penalty for which a person has not offered themselves voluntarily. We have servitude, which is an exacerbated form of forced labor, somewhere between forced labor and slavery. Debt bondage, where a person is bound to work to repay a debt, but the conditions of the debt are such that it can never be repaid and they are forced to work in perpetuity and they cannot leave. We have forced marriages, where people are forced or coerced into a marriage against their will and often forced to labor and sexually exploited in that context. And finally, human trafficking, where people are recruited, transported, transferred, harbored, or received through coercive means for the purpose of exploitation. In more concrete terms, modern slavery is a young man in Brazil, promised a decent job to help feed his family, trafficked onto an agricultural plantation, fenced and locked in, held at gunpoint, forced into hard labor, 17, 18, 20 hours a day, and fed with the pigs. It's a child in the Philippines being abused by a family member, live streamed for the sexual gratification of pedophiles in North America, Europe, and Australia. It's a woman in Bangladesh working grindingly long hours for very little pay in unsafe conditions so that multinational companies can churn out ever cheaper garments for the fast fashion mill. It's a man in Libya being sold on an auction block. It's a Yazidi woman forced into a marriage with a man that killed everyone she knew. It's a child being forced into a battle. And it's not something that's only happening far away from you. It's a 13-year-old boy in Manchester forced by criminal organizations to traffic drugs across county lines with no way to escape and no choice, under threat and coercion. It's a young woman in Birmingham whose family are forcing her into a marriage with a man 20 years older than her that she doesn't know, and forced into a life of domestic servitude and coerced sex. It's a migrant worker who came to the UK on a promise of a decent legal job, forced under threat of violence to him and his family to cultivate cannabis, working for no pay, held in inhuman conditions, and told if he goes to the police, they will send him to prison. It's 122,000 lives in this country and 50 million people around the world. Human beings exploited as if they were property and treated as if they were disposable. Slavery touches all of our lives in many different ways. It's in our towns and in our cities. It's in our factories and on our farms. In every 550 people in this country, there is a person in modern slavery. It's also that we estimate, that we think we know about. It's also in many of the things we buy, use, wear, and eat. The UK imports about 21 billion pounds, 21 billion pounds worth of goods at high risk of having been produced using forced labor in only their top 5 high-risk imports. That's garments, electronics, fish, textiles, and timber. There are many more products and commodities that we import, as well as services that we offshore, that are also at risk. And this is a tricky one, because the growth in consumer culture, demand for goods, and increasing globalization of our trade and supply chains have both positive and negative impacts. On the one hand, it can help to fuel development and innovation, bring critical new income streams to people in developing country, and ultimately increase quality of life. But on the other hand, it can lead to exploitation and abuse, as well as environmental degradation. How does this work? Let's think about just one high-risk product, the clothing that all of us are wearing, because this is not a nudist festival. There are risks of modern slavery at every stage in the garment supply chain, from growing and producing raw materials, to processing these into textiles, to manufacturing. And we can start at the very far end of the supply chain with raw materials. Let's look at the shirt you're wearing, things that most people in this room are wearing which involve cotton. Cotton production in many countries is heavily implicated in both forced labor and child labor. China is now the single largest producer of cotton in the global economy, 5.9 million metric tons in the 2021 to 22 crop year. About 90% of China's cotton is now produced in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, where the Chinese government has instituted a system of repression, including crimes against humanity and human rights abuses against the Uyghur, Kazakh, and other predominantly Muslim ethnic minority populations. The government has detained millions of Uyghurs and subjected them to forced labor, predominantly in the production of tomatoes, polysilicon, and cotton. And it's not just a China problem. Forced labor in cotton production has also been found in Benin, Burkina Faso, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, some of the largest cotton producers in the world. Cotton then needs to be processed. Raw cotton is ginned, spun, and woven into the textiles that make up our clothes. And here, cotton from multiple sources is combined into a single fabric, making it very difficult to ensure that cotton from a particular high-risk context has not made its way into the cotton being produced for your garments. And then there's an additional risk of exploitation in this stage. A lot of the textile production is also done in Xinjiang, under the same system of forced labor under which the cotton is produced. And in many other Asian and Pacific countries, textile production is subcontracted to home-based workers without formal contracts, which makes them vulnerable and one more step removed from oversight in the supply chain. With tight turnaround times and tiny profit margins, the risk of exploitative working conditions is high. In India, a practice known as sumangali is employed, where women and girls are offered employment in spinning mills with payment in a lump sum at the very end of their contract. They're then subjected to restrictions on their movement, forced to work long hours, exposed to physical and sexual abuse, and unable to leave before their contract ends without risking losing their entire earnings. Textiles are then manufactured into garments. This can also take place through these informal, subcontracted, home-based work, without formal contracts, making people at risk of exploitation. And garment factories in many different countries subject workers, predominantly women and girls, to exploitative working conditions and unsafe environments. Workers in Ethiopia were found to be earning as little as 12 cents an hour, in addition to then experiencing wage deductions as punishment, verbal abuse, and forced overtime. And although we started at the very far end of the supply chain, the pressures that drive these exploitative conditions come from much closer to home. The brands trying to cater to rapidly changing consumer preferences make unrealistic and inappropriate demands of suppliers, pressuring them to deliver faster and at lower cost. This pressures the suppliers to reduce their labor costs and increase working hours, exacerbating the risk of labor abuse. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw extreme examples of brands cancelling orders for products that had already been manufactured and refusing to pay. So the workers were dismissed, denied payment for the work that they had already completed for a Western brand, and ultimately wages were driven even further down and working conditions worsened. There are a lot of power imbalances and asymmetrical relationships in global supply chains. These imbalances perpetuate a system that allows significant profits to be generated, mostly at the top, while the same entities that hoard this profit drive a race to the bottom at every subsequent step in the supply chain. Primark reported an operating profit of £756 million in 2022. Shein, the new online fashion giant, reported profit of about $700 million US in 2022 and $1.1 billion in 2021. If just a fraction of that profit was shared across the supply chain instead of hoarded by investors, it could make a substantial difference in the lives of people working at every stage of production. And I should say it's not just low-cost brands that are implicated in this. Prada scored only 5 out of 100 on Know the Chain's fashion and apparel benchmark, and yet they registered a profit of 465 million euros in 2022. We talked about the exploitation that went into making your pockets. Now let's talk about the exploitation that goes into the thing that lives in your pocket, your phone. Phones are a much more complicated supply chain. Because of the constituent parts that go into it, there are very many and they're very complicated. So I'm just going to talk about one. In everyone's phone in this room, there is a lithium-ion rechargeable battery. They're also inside our tablets, laptops, electric cars, and inside every single lithium-ion battery on the planet is a substance called cobalt. The majority of the world's cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a vast country in the middle of Africa, 11 times the size of Great Britain. And we're not talking about a little bit more cobalt than anywhere else. We're talking about 70% of the entire world's cobalt production in 2022. And this isn't likely to change anytime soon because it's estimated that 50% of the entire world's cobalt reserve resides in this one country.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.